April 11th, 1241. The plains of Mohi slept beneath a crescent moon. The Sajó River shimmered like molten silver, winding through the Hungarian night. Mist curled above its surface, and torches flickered faintly among rows of tents. Inside, soldiers dreamed of glory, unaware that history was already awake. Horses stamped nervously, their breath ghosting in the cold air. Across the water, reeds swayed with secrets. The silence felt sacred, the kind that comes before something irreversible. No one yet imagined that by dawn, 40,000 men would lie still, and by noon, the world beyond the Carpathians would tremble. The river whispered softly as if it knew. In that quiet, the air seemed to hold its breath. The moon hung above a campfire's glow, and the embers burned red, like eyes watching from across the dark. The night was beautiful. The night was doomed. King Balafor's army slept behind its own faith. The Sajó, broad and calm, curved around their camp like a shield of glass. Bala believed the river would protect them, a natural wall against the east. Wagons were chained in a circle, tents packed tight behind them, and armor gleamed faintly under the stars. Men murmured in sleep while the sentries leaned on spears, lulled by stillness. Yet across that silver water, the Mongols were awake. Their engineers worked in whispers, laying planks, stretching ropes, hammering wood with padded strikes. A bridge began to rise from darkness. The sound of the river masked their labor, soft creaks blending with the current. The Hungarians dreamed of safety while their enemies walked across the water. By the time dawn came, the Sajó would no longer divide the living from the dead. It would simply carry both downstream. The first scream came from the riverbank. Then, thunder. Flaming barrels soared across the Sajó, trailing sparks that split the night. They struck the Hungarian bridge in bursts of light and fire. Tents erupted in flame. Horses reared and crashed into wagons. The river, once calm, turned red with reflection. Men woke choking on smoke, shouting orders no one heard. The Mongols didn't attack. They unveiled. Their fire wasn't rage. It was revelation. Each explosion tore open the illusion that the West was untouchable. The catapults roared again, the sky burning orange as the bridge crumbled into black water. Across the flames, shadows moved. Riders, silent and unhurried, watching chaos unfold. King Bala's army stumbled through its own inferno, blinded and broken before the enemy even crossed. The Sajó hissed as sparks died on its surface. In that sound, Europe heard the first breath of fear. On the far bank, Subutai watched the fire reflect in the water, each ripple another calculation. To him, this was not war, it was architecture. Every arrow, every silence measured and placed. His riders advanced in rhythm, their hooves muffled by the night soil, banners barely visible in the smoke. Behind him, Batu Khan waited, his face lit by shifting light, the air of Genghis, guiding a machine that stretched from the Pacific to the plains of Hungary. Across the Sajó, Subutai's bridge groaned as the last horse crossed, and the engineers dismantled it plank by plank, leaving only darkness behind. His messengers flashed signals through the haze, and ranks shifted with surgical precision. No shouting, no confusion, only movement. The Mongols didn't charge. They flowed, a tide of iron, quiet and exact. Where Europe trusted valor, Subutai trusted inevitability. The East had come, not with fury, but with design. By dawn, the Mongol vanguard struck the Hungarian camp like a storm breaking glass. Arrows fell in black waves, each soundless before it killed. The wagon ring that promised safety became a cage. Men stumbled through smoke, blinded and choking. Horses crashed into fire. Knights clawed at buckles that had melted from heat. The air was filled with the scent of burning leather and blood. King Bala's banners disappeared behind sheets of ash. Some tried to flee toward the river, only to find Subutai's flank already waiting. The Sajó glistened with corpses, its calm surface broken by drifting shields. The proud army that had once sung hymns of crusade was silent now, trampled into mud and memory. No signal came from the king's tent. No horn called retreat, only the steady hiss of fire and the rhythm of hooves receding eastward, already seeking the next empire to unmake. When the sun rose, it revealed revelation, not victory. The plain of Mohi steamed beneath dawn light, a valley of armor and ash. The Sajó ran dark with soot and blood, its banks littered with the debris of faith. Smoke rose like incense over ruin. The Mongols had not just broken Hungary, they had broken certainty. Across Europe, bells rang for prayers no longer answered. From Krakow to Vienna, whispers spread of an enemy that moved faster than thought, that fought like wind, that vanished like ghosts. Mohi was not a defeat. It was a warning written in fire. Subutai watched from a ridge, his banners snapping in the breeze, and turned west without triumph. Behind him, the bridge of Mohi burned. The last barrier between east and west turned to smoke. The age of stone and chivalry had met its mirror, and the reflection was unstoppable. In the year 1240, Hungary stood like a jewel between worlds. To the north, the Carpathians guarded her borders. To the south, the Danube glittered with the sails of traders from Byzantium. Fields stretched wide and golden, dotted with monasteries where morning bells called the faithful to prayer. The air smelled of wheat, incense, and smoke from hearths. Pilgrims walked the roads beside merchants, speaking Latin, Slavic, and Greek, a chorus of tongues bound by peace. In Esztergom and Buda, cathedrals rose beside bustling markets. The kingdom's heart beat with confidence, its people sure that geography itself was protection. King Bela IV ruled from marble halls, believing the Carpathians were walls of God, and that destiny favoured those who prayed the loudest. Yet beyond those same mountains, unseen beneath the snows, another people were already moving. Not pilgrims, not traders, but riders whose prayers were made of hooves and fire. Hungary's nobility shone like its rivers. Bright, disciplined, untested, knights rode beneath banners stitched with saints and sons, their armour gleaming like polished mirrors. In Bela's court, faith was armour and pride was law. Priests anointed swords before battle drills, and courtiers compared themselves to the paladins of old. The king himself, young and devout, believed he was chosen. A new Charlemagne destined to guard Christendom's eastern gate. In the royal chapel, mosaics glowed with golden halos while nobles toasted to divine favour. Beneath painted ceilings, prophecies were recited as if they were contracts. To them, holiness was strategy, and history was already decided. No one questioned that the kingdom was safe. No one asked what lay beyond the sunrise. And somewhere in that silence, the first faint echo of approaching thunder went unheard beneath the ring of church bells and the clatter of feast day laughter. Then came the messengers, not heralds, but survivors. They staggered into Esztergom barefoot, faces blackened by smoke, their speech trembling between sobs. They spoke of villages that vanished before sundown, of arrows that blotted out the sky, of riders who did not shout but sang as they killed. They called them demons. They said they came from the end of the earth. The court gathered in the great hall to hear them. The smell of blood and ash followed the men through the doors. Bela leaned forward, listening, while his nobles exchanged glances, half amusement, half unease. Some laughed. They had heard of raiders before. Others crossed themselves. The word Mongol drifted across the marble like a ghost, strange and heavy. One by one, courtiers looked toward the east-facing windows, where the light of morning seemed dimmer than before. Outside, the bells of Vespers began to toll. The Mongol envoys arrived weeks later, calm, immaculate, their clothes unstained by travel. They carried no weapons, only parchment, and a message in perfect courtesy: submit to the great Khan, or be destroyed. Their voices were steady, not threatening, as if they merely announced weather. To them, it was the custom of empire, to warn before the storm. To Bela and his council, it was blasphemy. Hungary was no vassal. Christ had no master beyond Rome. The king rose from his throne and gave his answer not in words, but in chains. The envoys were bound and sent westward, their composure unbroken even as the court cheered. It was not a triumph, it was an invitation. Across the steppes, word reached Subutai, the great mind of the Mongol war machine. He did not shout, he did not curse. He merely unfolded the message, studied the seal, and smiled once. Subutai was unlike any commander the West had imagined. He ruled not with presence, but with precision. His thoughts mapped landscapes the way others drew blood. While Europe prayed for peace, he studied rivers and roads, predicting how fear would travel faster than cavalry. His army became an instrument tuned to his design, a force that struck not where enemies stood, but where they would flee. All winter he planned. He divided the horde, sending one host through Poland to draw the northern knights away, while he himself prepared to thread the main body through the Carpathians. He built bridges before he reached rivers, scouted mountain passes while the snows still fell. For him, war was geometry, not fury. By the time spring approached, every ridge, river, and town of Hungary already lived in his mind. The kingdom slept. Subutai was awake, and he was almost ready to move. The winter of 1241 broke slowly, as if the world itself hesitated. Frost melted on the plains, and the Danube thawed, releasing the smell of mud and iron. Farmers returned to their fields, unaware that far to the east an army was stirring. Across the steppe, a low hum began, thousands of hooves striking frozen ground in unison. Hawks wheeled above endless grass, watching the horizon tremble. Snow cracked under weight, rivers splintered open, and the first riders crossed into Europe, not in haste, but with rhythm, a tide drawn by inevitability. To the west, church bells still rang over markets and harvests. To the east, the wind carried dust and whispers of war. By the time the thaw reached Hungary's rivers, the Mongols were already moving through the mountains, unseen and unstoppable. Spring had come, and with it, the sound of 1,000 worlds beginning to break. They came through the Carpathians, mountains older than memory, peaks where wind carved stone and men froze in prayer. No army had ever crossed them in winter. The Mongols did. They lashed siege engines to sledges, dragged them across ice, and rode through passes no map dared name. Where others would starve, they adapted. Horses chewed bark, soldiers ate snow and moss, and scouts disappeared into blizzards, only to reappear days later beyond the ridges. The mountains, meant to protect, became their proving ground. Subutai's engineers measured every slope, every current, every hour of light. Their campfires burned blue in the wind, low and smokeless. The sound of hooves echoed between walls of ice like a storm trapped in a bottle. When the first thaw came, they were already on the other side, cold, silent, and intact. The Carpathians had not stopped them. They had sharpened them. What followed was silence. Villages that had glowed with hearthlight vanished overnight. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Church doors hung open to empty pews. The wind moved through towns like a scavenger, carrying no scent of life. In Poland, the Knights of Christendom rode to meet the threat at Liegnitz, and died in ritual order, banners still raised. Their bodies were stripped, their heads piled high in a mound the Mongols called a warning. From the north to the Danube, only refugees remained. Farmers, priests, and widows, driving broken carts southward, eyes hollow, hands still shaking from unseen fire. They spoke of enemies who never slept, whose horses drank rivers dry, whose arrows came before the sound. The earth seemed to dim beneath their words. Where the Mongols had passed, even birds avoided the sky. Europe did not retreat that spring. It recoiled from itself. In the shadow of that silence, Bela called the banners. They came, nobles and peasants, crusaders and mercenaries, Cumans from the steppe, Germans from the forests, priests with relics hung around their necks. The camp outside Pest swelled into a moving city, tents stretching beyond sight, banners snapping above mud and rumour. But unity was illusion. The barons argued over command, bishops over omens, generals over tactics none could agree to. The Cumans, Bela's new allies, were distrusted, their faces too foreign, their horses too swift. Whispers of betrayal spread faster than orders. At night, campfires burned bright, but no man slept well. Every conversation ended with someone glancing east. When the wind shifted, it carried the scent of smoke from far-off fields, or perhaps only fear. The king rode between the tents, his crown hidden beneath a hood. He had his army, but not his trust. One night, a single rider arrived, blackened by fire, clothes in tatters, voice cracked to a whisper. He had ridden from the frontier, from a place that no longer existed. "They're everywhere," he rasped. "Not advancing, arriving, not armies, shadows." His words spread through the camp like contagion. Men who had prayed began to pack. Priests dropped their incense and ran. Bela listened, pale beneath the torchlight, and clung to the one defense left to him: faith in geography. "The river will hold," he said. "The Sajó will stop them." Orders were given. Thousands began the march east, armor clattering, hooves sinking in thawing soil. The king did not know that the Mongols had already crossed beyond his sight, that his map was already obsolete, that the whisper was not prophecy, but postscript. The plains ahead seemed endless, but their path led straight into a snare already closing. When the Hungarian army reached the Sajó, they found what looked like opportunity. On the far bank, Batu Khan's men were building a bridge. Bold, deliberate, almost theatrical. The noise of hammers carried across the water. To Bela, it was the sign of an enemy too confident, too exposed. He smiled for the first time in weeks. "We will strike at dawn," he said. But the bridge was not a mistake. It was a lure. The Mongols were showing him what he wanted to see, a threat that made sense. Beneath that spectacle, another current moved unseen. While torchlight glowed, on Batu's scaffold, Subbutai's engineers worked miles downstream, in silence. The Sajó gleamed like a knife in the dark, its edge hidden beneath reeds. And the Hungarians, fixed on the bridge before them, never noticed that the river had already begun to surround them. Night fell heavy over the Sajó. The Hungarian camp settled behind its ring of wagons, confident the river marked safety's edge. But south of their fires, Subbutai's army moved. Men waded through reeds, leading horses that did not neigh, ropes whispering as they sank into water. Pontoons rose in silence. The second bridge took shape beneath the moon. No horn sounded. No scout returned. By the time the Hungarians heard the faint splash of hooves, it was already too late. From the north, Batu's feigned advance pressed against their lines. From the south, Subbutai's real assault crossed unseen. The jaws closed without a sound. The Sajó, once a boundary, became a trap. Then came the first flare, a single torch arcing into the sky. It fell upon the Hungarian tents, and the camp bloomed into fire. The trap was sprung, and the river began to run red. It began with chance. A Hungarian patrol, restless in the pre-dawn stillness, rode toward the Sajó bridge and saw movement in the mist. Mongol engineers bent over their work, hammering silently beneath a rising fog. The patrol charged without thought. Steel met. Flesh shouts split the quiet, and the bridge erupted in fire. Arrows hissed from across the river, tracing red arcs through the dark. One by one, the horsemen fell into the flames. The survivors stumbled back toward camp, trailing smoke and panic. But the Mongols had already crossed elsewhere. To the north, riders moved unseen through reeds. To the south, Subbutai's flank flowed over the second bridge like a river of black armor. The patrol's charge had not stopped the storm. It had awakened it. As the first light of dawn broke across the Sajó, the horizon was already burning. The battle had begun before anyone realized it. Inside the wagon fort, chaos became scripture. Men woke to the sound of thunder without clouds, drums pounding from every direction. Orders clashed, voices rose, horses screamed against the confines of the camp. Bela's knights stumbled through smoke and confusion, trying to find formation in a place built for prayer, not for war. The wagons, meant to shield them, trapped the heat. Mongol catapults hurled stones that fell like meteors. Jars of oil burst into rivers of fire. Flames crawled up the tent ropes, turning cloth into smoke and men into shadows. The air itself seemed to choke the living. Bela shouted for calm, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. Every breath was ash, every step a retreat. The camp, a city by sunrise, had become a furnace by dawn. From the outside, the Mongols encircled it like surgeons. From within, the Hungarians collapsed in their own walls. With the fires closing in, Bela gave the only order left: break out. The gates were unchained, and the knights rode forth, banners snapping, voices raised in desperate courage. For a heartbeat, they believed the path was open. The Mongols parted before them, a corridor of false hope stretching through dust and flame. Then, the trap snapped shut. From both sides came the hiss of arrows, the steady, mechanical rain of death. Horses crashed mid-stride, Men toppled before their swords cleared scabbards. The ground turned to mire, swallowing hoof and man alike. A knight reached for his brother, grasped only smoke. A priest fell with his cross still raised. The corridor that promised freedom became a funnel of ruin. Bela watched from behind the smoke, seeing not an army, but a nation dissolving before his eyes. The breakout was not an escape. It was the end given shape. By mid-morning, the plain had become a single scream. Dust and fire mingled until sight itself was useless. Arrows fell like rain, and men fought shadows they could not see. The air tasted of blood and iron. Knights swung blindly at ghosts, blades catching only air. Horses thrashed in pools of mud that once were grass. Helmets melted, armor cracked. No strategy remained, only instinct. To crawl, to breathe, to die slower. Subutai's rhythm was inhuman. Volleys timed to heartbeat, impact to breath. The Mongols did not fight. They erased. Amid the chaos, a single chronicler would later write, "Swords missed, arrows did not." There was no music, no rally, no last stand. Only the sound of men burning and the steady pulse of drums guiding their extinction. By the time the dust settled, the plain itself seemed to bleed. When the sun reached its height, the killing was done. The Sajó River, the line Bela had trusted, ran thick with corpses. Men, horses, armor, all tangled together, drifting beneath the broken bridge. The current pulled at banners, carrying them downstream like shrouds. The air was still. No cries, no commands, only the whisper of water sliding over steel. The bridge, once the heart of the defense, collapsed beneath the weight of the dead. From the far bank, Mongol riders watched in silence. No celebration, no cruelty, just completion. The Hungarian host was gone, unmade in a single morning. Along the shore, armor glinted faintly in the sun, and crows began to gather. The Sajó had been the promise of safety. Now it was the grave of a kingdom, and as its waters turned red, even the river seemed to recoil from what it had done. King Bela fled into the smoke. His horse limped, foam streaking its flanks, its eyes rolling white with terror. Around him, nothing remained. No banners, no trumpets, no voices that answered his call. His crown, once bright as sunrise, was gone, trampled into the mud of Mohi. The king of Hungary was now a fugitive among his own dead. He rode through fields of bodies where nobles and peasants lay side by side, their armor cooling in the wind. Each mile carried him farther from power, closer to exile. Behind him, the Mongol army moved like a tide, unhurried, unstoppable. Bela looked back once. The horizon was fire. The air smelled of smoke and endings. The kingdom he had sworn to protect had vanished in a single dawn, and somewhere in the riverbed, beneath the drifting corpses and broken steel, his crown lay half buried, shining faintly, and then gone. The war did not end at Mohi. It spread. For months, the Mongols moved through Hungary like a fever, not conquering, only consuming. They left nothing behind them but wind and ruin. Eger burned first, its towers collapsing in fire. Then Vak, then Győr. Each city disappeared as if scraped from the map. The plains glowed red at night, a horizon of smoke. Those who fled carried only silence. There were no words left for what they had seen. The Mongols did not occupy. They erased. Villages became ash heaps. Roads vanished beneath black soil. Trees bore the marks of fire like scars of a second sun. No one counted the dead because there was no one left to count. The sound of war was gone now, replaced by the steady hiss of smouldering earth. This was not conquest. It was erasure, the undoing of a kingdom's breath. Winter came like mercy, but mercy froze. The Danube turned to glass beneath the hooves of Mongol riders. Across its frozen skin they advanced, swift and endless, the cold carrying their strength where walls could not. Villages burned even as the snow fell. But when spring thawed the ice, the river changed its allegiance. The dead it had watched fall, it now carried. Bodies drifted through its current, pale and bloated, tangled in reeds. Fishermen no longer cast nets. They prayed for the water to pass quietly. In Pest, they said the Danube groaned at night, as if straining to remember all the names it had swallowed. Mothers walked its banks searching for rings, for armour, for fragments of their sons. The river that once bound Hungary together became its dirge, flowing ever east, carrying grief to the sea, where even salt could not cleanse what it had seen. In Pest, famine arrived before the ashes cooled. Then came plague. The air stank of rot and smoke. The living buried the dead until they no longer could. Churches stood hollow, their bells cold and still. When the wind blew, the silence was so complete it hurt. Half the kingdom was gone. The rest wandered among ruins, searching for names carved into nothing. Bread hardened in empty ovens. Smoke rose from hearths without homes. Even the dogs stopped barking. Priests whispered prayers no one heard, their voices dissolving in frost. The Mongols had left no walls unbroken, but their worst wound was this, the quiet that followed. A silence so heavy, it pressed the breath from the land. Hungary did not die screaming. It died listening, waiting for the bells to ring again. And they never did. And then, without warning, the riders were gone. No battle, no treaty, just emptiness. One dawn, the scouts who waited for another raid found only smoke trailing east. Fields that had trembled under hoofprints lay still. The Mongols vanished as suddenly as they had come. Word spread like rumour. Ogedei Khan, the great Khan, was dead. Batu and his princes turned home to claim succession. No one believed it at first. How could an empire so vast disappear overnight? Yet the tracks led east, fading into steppe and mist. Hungary stood, not victorious, merely spared. The invincible army had not been defeated. It had been distracted by destiny. The silence they left behind was not peace. It was shock. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The Mongols had come like a storm and left like a shadow. The only sound that remained was the wind moving through the graves. Bela returned months later, gaunt and grey, riding through a kingdom that no longer recognized him. Pest lay broken, churches hollow, streets filled with bones bleached pale by sun. He dismounted before the shattered cathedral, where the altar was buried beneath rubble. There, in the dust of what had been faith, he made his vow. Hungary would not vanish as its cities had. He would rebuild, not for glory, but for survival. Like Rome after its sack, this too would rise again. He summoned masons from the west, settlers from the south, architects from distant lands. The stones were laid heavier, thicker, higher than before. Every wall was a promise, every fortress a prayer. Bela became less a king than a craftsman of endurance. History would remember him not for the crown he lost in battle, but for the kingdom he reforged from silence and ruin. Centuries passed, but April 11th never left Hungary. The day of Mohi became a scar that no calendar could conceal. It was spoken softly, never toasted, never forgotten. Mothers told it to their sons not as legend, but as warning. Monks recorded it in ink darker than any other date, as though even parchment feared to fade it. Bela's oath endured through them. Fortress by fortress, the kingdom rose again, built not upon pride, but memory. Its stones carried the echo of that morning when the river ran red and the sky turned to ash. And in that remembrance lay strength. The Mongols had taken everything except the will to rebuild. From ruin came a new Hungary, one born of loss, tempered by endurance, consecrated by silence. Bela became known as the second founder. And though time moved on, each April, the wind still carried a whisper across the plains. Remember Mohi, the Mongols reached the edge of Europe, and then vanished. No one knew why. But their absence did not bring relief. It brought resolve. Across the continent, kings began to build higher, thicker, harder. Castles rose like teeth against the horizon. Armies drilled through every season. learning to move as one. Watchtowers sprouted from hills, and couriers rode day and night, with news of any shadow from the east. Mohi became the ghost that trained a generation. A story whispered in every hall. That power alone cannot protect, only preparation can. What the Mongols destroyed in months, Europe spent centuries fortifying against. The memory of hooves on frozen ground lingered like thunder behind mountains. In every fortress stone, in every cold wind sweeping from the plains, the warning remained that the steppe could return, and when it did, the world would be ready to meet it with fire of its own. For Hungary, Mohi was not the end, it was the forge. Bela returned to his broken land and began again, one stone at a time. The wooden forts that once burned in a night rose again in granite and lime. Cities rebuilt themselves around walls thick enough to outlast memory. Soldiers were no longer peasants with spears, but trained men of discipline, bound by oath and steel. Bela's command was not to avenge, but to endure. He knew the steppe would never truly be gone, only waiting beyond the horizon. So Hungary learned to live in vigilance. Each new tower was both a prayer and a weapon. Each soldier's march echoed the hoofbeats they once feared. In ruin, the kingdom found rhythm. In ashes, it found iron. Bela's Hungary was not what it had been before Mohi. It was what the fire had left behind, stronger, colder, and unbreakable. Centuries later, the land still speaks. Farmers ploughing the soft Hungarian earth sometimes hear the scrape of metal beneath their blades. They stop, kneel, and uncover the blackened tips of Mongol arrows, relics of a night when fire reigned and history broke. The soil has long since healed, but the memory beneath it never does. These fragments lie among roots and stones, quiet as bones. Each one tells a story older than the villages around it, a reminder that even harvest fields once burned. Archaeologists lift them from the ground as if pulling breath from centuries. The steppe may have withdrawn, but its echo remains buried in the earth, patient, enduring. And as crops grow above the scars, Hungary's strength grows from the same soil that once drank its sorrow. The arrows sleep, but the land remembers. Mohi did not end in victory, but it did not end in extinction either. Europe bled, but it did not break. The Mongols had torn through kingdoms and faiths, yet here, at the edge of the West, something held. Not an army, not a wall, but a will, the knowledge that even crushed courage could endure. In the years that followed, this defeat became something stranger, a foundation. From its ashes rose alliances, reformations, new strategies of war and survival. The Mongols showed the world its weakness, and in that mirror, Europe found its strength. They were never forgotten, not because they conquered, but because they left the continent unbowed. Mohi became a turning point not of triumph, but of awakening. The West had met its reckoning and lived. Sometimes survival, however scarred, speaks louder than victory ever could. The Sajó runs quietly now. Its water glides over smooth stones, whispering against reeds that bend in the dawn light. No smoke, no screams, and only birdsong. But beneath that calm surface, the river remembers. Its currents once carried blood and armor, kings and soldiers alike. It has seen death so vast that even the earth went silent. Centuries later, when the wind crosses the plains, locals say they still hear it. A faint rhythm, like hooves striking water, like drums far away. The Sajó has outlived empires, its banks reborn in green each spring. Yet it keeps its memory not in grief, but in quiet reverence. For the river knows what men forget, that even after ruin, life returns. The water that once bore fire now carries reflection. The river forgave long ago, but it never forgot. In its depths, history rests, heavy, unseen, and always moving east. Empires rise like storms and vanish into dust, but memory endures. The Mongols moved like wind, unstoppable, invisible, gone. Yet their shadow shaped everything that followed. From Mohi's fire came Europe's caution, its stone, its strength. Hungary stood again, its scars turned into monuments, its silence into song. The story of Mohi was not one of defeat. It was one of refusal, to fall, to fade, to be erased. The plains still glow gold under morning light. The Sajó still winds through its banks, calm as the breath of the past. And when the wind stirs that grass, it carries something unseen, not sorrow, but endurance, the echo of riders who once came like thunder, and of a people who learned to outlast them. Empires vanish, dust settles, names are forgotten. But memory rides forever, and it never stops at the river,